Representative Khanna just cornered Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in a masterful display of congressional oversight, exposing a terrifying reality. The Pentagon knows exactly what it costs to justify a sprawling conflict, but it absolutely refuses to calculate the price of its most tragic consequences. What unfolded in that hearing room was not merely a standard political back and forth, but rather a sustained, methodical dismantling of the administration's entire financial and moral accounting framework for the current war in Iran. Through a series of perfectly calibrated questions, each designed to expose a different category of missing information.
What is the cost of Iran holding that straight at issue with nuclear weapons?
It's $631 billion, which means it's an increase of $5,000 a year for American households. Now, let me give you this point. You're saying that your operation is preventing a nuclear Iran. Will you acknowledge that there is an economic cost to the American people for doing what you believe is necessary to make Iran denuclear? Will you acknowledge the economic cost?
We have an incredible economic team that's managing this better than what the previous administration did to our economy, what the previous administration did with inflation,
you know what's upsetting?
I reclaim my time. With COVID, and you're going to lecture this administration about the economy?
You know what is upsetting?
Incredible.
You didn't even do the analysis on how much it's costing the American people. It's one thing if you said, okay, it costs the American people $5,000, but we think it's worth it. That's what we've done in World War II and other wars. Here's what it costs. You got to pay for it. You don't even know what the average American is paying. You don't know what we paid in terms of the missiles that hit the Iranian school. You don't know what we're paying in terms of gas. You don't know what we're paying in terms of food. Your 25 billion number is totally off.
Khanna stripped away the bureaucratic shielding to reveal the single most important truth about how this Secretary of Defense understands his own accountability to the American public. The defining moment of this hearing, and perhaps the moral epicenter of the entire political discourse surrounding this conflict, began with a profoundly uncomfortable inquiry that deserves the utmost scrutiny. Representative Khanna, who has firmly established himself as one of the most persistent and rigorous voices in the House speaking out against unaccountable military spending, directed a highly specific, inescapable question to the Secretary of Defense.
It's the incompetence. It's the incompetence. Let me ask you this. Certainly, maybe here we'll find agreement. There was still 440 pounds of low-enriched uranium, correct, when President Obama, after the JCPOA? Is that accurate?
The amounts and types are classified.
Okay. Will you acknowledge that there were 970 pounds of uranium enriched after Trump tore up the JCPOA?
The JCPOA was a terrible deal that allowed Iran a path to a nuclear bomb.
You deal with vague platitudes. I'm asking you about numbers. Like, you don't know what gas costs. You don't know what food costs. You don't know what the operation costs. You know, I get sound bites.
He asked for the exact financial cost to American taxpayers of the missiles deployed in a military strike on an Iranian school, a devastating strike in which children were killed. This was not a disputed event born from the fog of war rumors. The strike occurred in reality, and the tragedy was openly acknowledged by the administration itself, which categorized the horrific event as an unfortunate situation that remains under investigation. That characterization alone confirms its occurrence without contesting the core, heartbreaking fact. Children died in an operation executed with American weaponry, funded by American taxpayers, and overseen by the very military command represented by the Secretary sitting comfortably across the witness table. Secretary Hegseth's initial instinct was to lean heavily on procedural deflection, a standard bureaucratic maneuver when faced with grim realities. He stated that because the unfortunate situation was still under investigation, he would not tie a cost to it. However, as the careful analysis of this exchange reveals, this defensive posture fundamentally misidentifies the very nature of the inquiry being presented. Representative Khanna was not requesting the intricate targeting decision rationale. He was not demanding the highly classified operational intelligence that led to the selection of the location, nor was he asking for the tactical, step-by-step details of how the strike was mechanically executed. Khanna was asking a fundamental procurement question. He was asking a budget question, which is precisely the kind of foundational oversight inquiry the House Armed Services Committee was designed and exists specifically to ask and investigate. The internal investigation into the strike's legal justification or tactical propriety exists in an entirely separate Department of Defense tracking system from the procurement costs of munitions. These pieces of information are tracked for entirely separate purposes, meaning the ongoing status of the investigation has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the availability of the financial data. When pressed, Secretary Hegseth offered a follow-up statement that stands as arguably the most revealing non-answer of the entire hearing. He explicitly stated that he wouldn't tie a cost to that to anything. This phrasing requires careful, deliberate scrutiny because it is doing something very specific and deeply revealing. The secretary did not claim that the number was legally classified. He did not claim that the financial data was technologically unavailable to him or his department. He stated that he would not tie a cost to it, making his refusal entirely volitional rather than procedural. He made a personal, deliberate choice to refuse to attach a monetary figure to a strike that resulted in the deaths of children, because doing so creates a quantifiable, politically uncomfortable line item in the war's accounting ledger. It takes an event that could otherwise be shrouded in the somber, nebulous language of ongoing investigations and places it starkly onto a budget spreadsheet, forcing it to sit side by side with the costs of the tactical victories that the administration is otherwise eager to tout. The secretary is perfectly willing to cite the cost of weapons that secure strategic wins, such as the destruction of the Iranian Navy, but he simply cannot bring himself to cite the cost of weapons that hit a civilian school. That asymmetry is not a matter of financial accounting. It is moral compartmentalization masquerading as bureaucratic procedure. Representative Khanna immediately dismantled this evasion, reminding the secretary that it is a perfectly reasonable question because American taxpayer money funded the operation. This observation cuts straight to the foundational principle of congressional oversight on military spending. If taxpayer funds are utilized, Congress, acting as the representative of those taxpayers, possesses the unquestionable constitutional obligation to demand accountability for how those funds were spent and what they cost. Refusing to answer a cost question about a specific military strike on the hollow grounds that the strike is under investigation is not a legally or procedurally defensible position. It is a conscious choice to avoid accountability for a specific, undeniably uncomfortable fact. The methodical dismantling continued seamlessly as Representative Khanna shifted the focus of the interrogation from the localized theater of war to the broader macroeconomic footprint of the two-month-old conflict. The secretary had previously testified on the record that the cost of the munitions used thus far amounted to roughly $25 billion. Khanna challenged this figure directly, asking what the true total cost has been over the last 60 days when factoring in the massive damage sustained by American bases, as well as the exorbitant replacement costs for munitions and aircraft calculated in today's highly inflated dollars. Secretary Hegseth attempted to defend his testimony, stating that the $25 billion figure accurately reflected the total costs they were seeing, supposedly including the purchase of new weapons, replacements, and damages in today's dollars. However, he quickly created a rhetorical buffer for himself by stating that if there were any necessary adjustments to that number, he would defer to the comptroller, effectively passing the buck on the exactitude of his own stated budget. When pressed on whether the administration would be returning to the committee to ask for supplemental funding specifically for the Iran mission, the secretary admitted that any future supplemental request would be related to the entirety of their global objectives, not just the Iran munitions. He stubbornly maintained that the portion strictly allocated to Iran would remain under $25 billion, but conceded they would inevitably ask for a lot more beyond that scope. Khanna offered a stern warning in response, suggesting the secretary might want to revise those figures as numerous economic and military experts are actively disagreeing with the administration's assessments regarding replacement costs and base damages in today's economic climate. The exchange reached a critical structural crescendo when the line of questioning moved away from the battlefield and straight into the domestic homeland. Khanna bluntly asked the secretary if he knew how much this conflict would cost everyday Americans in terms of increased prices for essential goods like gas and food over the next year. This inquiry did not tread anywhere near classified operational intelligence. It relied entirely on public, accessible economic data, the kind of vital data routinely tracked daily by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Energy Information Administration, the Federal Reserve, and every major economic institution across the country. It is exactly the kind of question that any administration boasting about having an incredible economic team monitoring the war's domestic impact should be able to answer immediately, specifically, and with total confidence. Instead of addressing the domestic economic fallout that is actively hurting citizens, Secretary Hegseth executed a tactical pivot. He flatly refused to answer, instead responding with a deflection by posing a counter question. What is the cost of an Iranian nuclear bomb? This is a highly familiar rhetorical strategy repeatedly deployed by the administration. When confronted with the deeply uncomfortable realities of a policy's true cost, redirect the entire conversation to a terrifying hypothetical scenario that makes the current policy appear absolutely essential and beyond questioning. The cost of inaction becomes the impenetrable shield. The administration deploys every single time the true cost of action is requested by oversight committees. Khanna accurately and immediately identified this redirection, pointing out that asking the Secretary of Defense about the tangible economic impact of his war on American families at the gas pump and the grocery store is the farthest thing from a political gotcha question. For ordinary Americans, people who have no security clearances, no access to tactical briefings, and no visibility into the grand strategic rationale the administration presents behind closed doors to Congress, the most direct, most immediate, and most personally felt consequence of this foreign conflict is the price they pay for gas. The public data unequivocally shows that gas prices spiked drastically from $2.83 to $4.23 during the roughly 60-day window corresponding to the outbreak of the conflict. That is a staggering 50% increase in the single most universally experienced economic metric in American daily life, occurring precisely during a war that the administration is simultaneously claiming to be an astonishing, unmitigated success. When Hegseth continually refused to answer the domestic cost question and stubbornly kept returning to his hypothetical nuclear bomb counter question, Khanna executed what is perhaps the most devastating rhetorical move in the entire exchange. He took the secretary's counter question and actually answered it for him, doing the complex macroeconomic math out loud right there in the hearing room. Khanna explicitly stated that the cost of Iran successfully controlling the Strait of Hormuz with nuclear weapons is estimated at $631 billion, a catastrophic figure which translates to a massive $5,000 annual increase in living expenses for every single American household. Khanna provided this highly specific figure directly, instantly, and with the unwavering confidence of a representative who had arrived at the hearing, having actually done the rigorous analysis that the administration's own supposedly incredible economic team either completely failed to do or willfully chose to conceal from the public. He then brilliantly turned that terrifying number directly back onto the secretary and the war itself. Khanna argued that since the catastrophic cost of inaction had now been established and acknowledged, the administration must now finally acknowledge the tangible, painful economic cost of action being paid right now, today, by American families who are filling their gas tanks at prices 50% higher than they were just 60 days ago. Secretary Hegseth's response to this undeniable reality was a complete and total abandonment of the very pretense of accountability. He stated that they have an incredible economic team that is managing the situation far better than what the previous administration did to the economy and inflation. This was not an answer. It was a desperate pivot to a different administration, a different economic period, and a different political argument entirely, engineered specifically to avoid acknowledging a painful domestic cost that is clearly documented in public data available to anyone with an internet connection. Khanna seized on this evasion immediately, explicitly calling out the administration's behavior with a single word he repeated twice for deliberate emphasis: incompetence. Not malice, not bad faith, but pure, unadulterated incompetence. Khanna argued passionately that it is a profound failure of basic governance, that an administration fighting a war cannot accurately calculate the civilian economic costs of the conflict, the prices at the pump, the grocery store inflation, the financial reality of the school strike, and the unestimated base damages, while simultaneously being able to easily and confidently cite the tactical costs of the munitions expended to justify their ongoing policy. The intense interrogation subsequently shifted gears to reveal a different, yet equally troubling, gap in the administration's accountability: a fundamental lack of factual command regarding established historical data. Representative Khanna pressed the secretary to confirm a highly specific, widely documented historical figure regarding the Obama-era Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. He asked for simple confirmation that Iran possessed exactly 440 pounds of low-enriched uranium under the strict parameters of that deal. This figure is an established historical baseline. It is a number that has been exhaustively reported by the International Atomic Energy Agency, cited repeatedly in public congressional testimony, published in countless arms control analyses, and discussed extensively throughout the foreign policy literature surrounding the agreement. It is definitively not a classified state secret. It is the fundamental baseline figure against which all subsequent nuclear enrichment growth was globally measured. Yet, when confronted with this basic historical fact, Secretary Hegseth immediately stonewalled the committee, claiming defensively that the amounts and types of uranium are classified. This specific response deserves the highest level of scrutiny. Applying a stringent national security classification label to widely available historical open source intelligence appears to be a highly strategic, arguably manipulative maneuver designed specifically to avoid engaging with a factual baseline that deeply undermines the current administration's entire political narrative surrounding the JCPOA. Khanna, refusing to be deterred by the veil of classification, relentlessly pushed forward, asking about the enrichment figures following the Trump administration's controversial withdrawal from the international agreement. He demanded the secretary acknowledge the undeniable reality that Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles surged to approximately 970 pounds, more than double the original baseline after the previous administration tore up the deal. This, too, is a widely documented figure originating from public IAEA reporting, widely known and absolutely not classified in any ordinary logical sense of the word. Once again, rather than engaging with the empirical historical data presented to him, Hegseth retreated into safe, ideological talking points, declaring the JCPOA to be nothing more than a terrible deal that allowed Iran a clear path to a nuclear bomb. This was a purely political policy argument, not a substantive response to a direct factual question about historical stockpile levels. Khanna diagnosed this pattern of evasion perfectly, delivering what stands as the sharpest, most clarifying rebuke of the entire hearing. You deal in vague platitudes while I am asking you about numbers. You don't know what gas costs, you don't know what food costs, you don't know what the military operation costs. You just give me sound bites when I am asking for actual numbers. In the final tense moments of the exchange, the overarching argument regarding bureaucratic transparency and budgetary accountability transformed dramatically into a razor-sharp, deeply personal political indictment. Cornered relentlessly on the undeniable issue of skyrocketing domestic costs impacting voters, Secretary Hegseth abandoned all pretenses of national economic defense and launched a petty regional partisan attack. He claimed that the price of gas is twice as expensive in California, which happens to be Khanna's home state, simply because of the horrible policies pursued by that state's government. Khanna instantly recognized this desperate maneuver as a tired, worn-out deflection tactic that has vastly outlived its political utility with the American public. He astutely pointed out that while that specific brand of divisive rhetoric used to be highly effective on the campaign trail, the administration is now actively bleeding support and losing the very voters they campaigned so hard to protect. Khanna reminded the secretary and everyone watching of the administration's foundational ironclad campaign promises. They explicitly pledged to keep the country out of bad foreign wars, and they promised to bring down the skyrocketing prices of everyday goods. The representative then delivered a surgically targeted, utterly devastating concluding statement that completely reframed the political reality of the room. He stated that he was profoundly sad for all the people who enthusiastically voted for Trump because this administration has fundamentally betrayed them, specifically noting that they have betrayed a massive portion of that loyal MAGA base. This closing argument was absolutely not designed to appeal to anti-war Democrats who had opposed the conflict from the very beginning. It was meticulously and deliberately aimed directly at the specific core voter coalition that elected the administration in the first place, shining a blinding light on the glaring, undeniable contradiction between their concrete promises of peace and prosperity and the grim current reality of an uncosted, sprawling war and gas prices sitting 50% higher than when the conflict began. To twist the knife further, Khanna invoked the vice president directly, stating that J.D. Vance knows exactly what is happening. By naming Vance, Khanna brilliantly implied that the grave concern about the administration's catastrophic failure to deliver on its core promises is not merely an external partisan attack from the opposition, but a deeply internalized crisis fully acknowledged at the highest levels within the administration's own building. Secretary Hegseth offered absolutely no response as his time unceremoniously expired and the floor was promptly yielded to a gentleman from Nebraska. The silence echoing in the chamber was utterly deafening. When the dust finally settled on this relentless, masterful interrogation, the terrifying structural thesis of the administration's oversight strategy was laid completely bare for the world to see. Over the course of the intense hearing, 12 separate, highly specific accountability questions regarding the true cost of the conflict were left entirely unanswered. Only one single number was provided instantly and confidently during the entire exchange regarding the conflict's economic realities. The $631 billion theoretical cost of an Iranian nuclear threat. This stark, unignorable asymmetry is the definitive, lasting story of the administration's deeply flawed management of the war. Every solitary metric, hypothetical scenario, or data point that can possibly be utilized to justify the ongoing necessity of the conflict is readily available, perfectly curated, and instantly deployed by the Pentagon. Conversely, absolutely any data point required by Congress or the American public to independently and accurately evaluate the actual human and economic toll being incurred, the true devastating cost of the munitions, the horrific financial reality of the school strike, the agonizing spikes in civilian grocery bills, and the baseline historical uranium figures is conveniently classified, locked safely behind an ongoing internal investigation, or simply deemed an uncomfortable topic that the Secretary of Defense wouldn't tie a cost to.